Sometimes pride comes before a fall, and sometimes it comes before the most beautiful rise you never saw coming. Sometimes the dirtiest hands hold the purest hearts, and sometimes the finest silk dresses hide the emptiest souls. In 1883 Colorado Territory, Magnus Thorne stood 6 feet 11 inches tall in his worn leather boots, his shoulders broad enough to block out the mountain sun, with hands that could crush granite, but moved with the gentleness of a man who'd learned to handle precious things. His dark hair hung past his collar, and 3 months of mountain living had left his face bronzed and his beard thick. But his blue eyes held a quiet intelligence that most folks missed when they saw the dirt under his fingernails. Victoria Ashford had arrived in Silver Creek with her father's railroad money and her mother's Eastern manners, trapped in a dying mining town because Daddy's investments had gone sour and pride wouldn't let them crawl back to Boston broke. "I'll find enough gold in these mountains to buy you a palace," Magnus had sworn to her that first day she'd laughed at his muddy boots in her hotel lobby. "And when I do, you'll marry me." What kind of desperate woman would it take to say yes to a proposal like that? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me tell you how it really started, 3 months before that impossible promise. Victoria Ashford stepped off the narrow-gauge railway onto the wooden platform of Silver Creek, Colorado, holding her silk parasol like a shield against the mountain dust and the stares of weathered miners. Her burgundy traveling dress, with its intricate beadwork and bustled skirt, had cost more than most of these men made in a month. She knew because Daddy had told her so, right before he'd explained why they were trading their Boston mansion for a ramshackle hotel in a town that smelled of sulfur and broken dreams. The Ashford Mining Consortium owns half the claims in this valley. Her father, Harrison Ashford, had said from behind his silver-topped cane, "We're not visitors here, Victoria. We're investors." But Victoria had seen the worry lines around his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Daddy's railroad fortune was hemorrhaging money faster than a busted dam, and this mining venture was either going to save them or finish them completely. The Grand Mountain Hotel rose 3 stories above Silver Creek's main street, its false front painted bright yellow to hide the warped boards beneath. Victoria followed her father through the lobby, past leather chairs that had seen better decades and a crystal chandelier that had somehow survived the journey from civilization. The whole place felt like putting silk gloves on a mule fancy on the surface, but the rough edges showed through. "Your rooms are ready, Mr. Ashford," said the desk clerk, a thin man with nervous hands who kept glancing toward the saloon across the street. "Best suites in the house, overlooking the creek." Victoria accepted her key and was heading toward the stairs when the front door burst open with a crash that made every head turn. A mountain of a man filled the doorframe, so tall he had to duck his head to enter. His clothes were caked with mud and rock dust. His boots left clumps of dirt on the Persian rug, and when he removed his battered hat, dark hair fell across eyes the color of deep mountain lakes. The lobby fell silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Need to speak with Ashford," the giant said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd never had to raise it to be heard. "Got business to discuss." Victoria watched her father's face harden as he took in the man's appearance, the torn shirt, the calloused hands, the way the other hotel guests instinctively stepped back from his imposing presence. "I don't conduct business with." Harrison paused, his lip curling with distaste. "Prospectors who can't be bothered to clean themselves before entering a respectable establishment." A few nervous chuckles echoed through the lobby. Victoria found herself studying the stranger's face, expecting to see embarrassment or anger. Instead, she saw something that surprised her amusement dancing in those blue eyes, as if he was enjoying a private joke. "Fair enough," the man said, settling his hat back on his head. "When you're ready to hear about the richest vein of gold in these mountains, you know where to find me." He turned to leave, but not before his gaze found Victoria. For just a moment, their eyes met, and she felt something flutter in her chest, a recognition she couldn't name. Then he smiled, a slow curve of his lips that transformed his weathered face into something almost handsome, and tipped his hat to her. "Miss," he said simply, and walked out into the afternoon sun. Victoria realized she'd been holding her breath. "Presumptuous fool," her father muttered, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. probably hasn't seen real gold in his life. But Victoria had caught something in the stranger's voice when he mentioned that gold vein, not desperation or bragging, but the quiet certainty of a man stating simple facts. She'd heard that same tone when her father discussed his most profitable investments, back when the Ashford name still opened every door in Boston. "Who was that?" she asked the desk clerk as her father stormed toward the stairs. "Magnus Thorne," the man whispered, glancing around to make sure Mr. Ashford was out of earshot. "Been working claims up in Dead Man's Gulch for near on 6 months. Keeps to himself mostly, but folks say he's found something up there. Something big." Victoria filed that information away and followed her father to their rooms, but she found herself lingering by the window that overlooked Main Street. Down below, she could see Magnus Thorne's tall figure disappearing into the general store, and she wondered what kind of man had the confidence to walk into a fancy hotel covered in mud and make promises about gold. 3 days passed before she saw him again. Victoria had taken to walking the length of Silver Creek each morning, partly for exercise and partly because the hotel's walls felt like they were closing in around her. The town was rougher than anything she'd known in Boston. Men spat tobacco juice into the street. The saloons never seemed to close, and every other building was either a brothel or a place that might as well have been. But there was something honest about it too. These people didn't hide their struggles behind polite conversation and China tea sets. When they were broke, they said so. When they struck pay dirt, they celebrated in the street. There was a freedom in that honesty that Victoria found both frightening and appealing. She was examining the display window of Henderson's Dry Goods, admiring a bolt of blue calico that reminded her of summer skies, when a shadow fell across the glass. "Pretty fabric," said a familiar deep voice. "Would make a fine dress for a woman who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty." Victoria turned, expecting to see the same mud-caked mountain man from the hotel lobby. Instead, she found Magnus Thorne clean-shaven and wearing clothes that, while still work-worn, were freshly laundered. His dark hair was combed back from his face, revealing sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. Without the dirt and exhaustion, he was actually quite handsome in a rugged, untamed sort of way that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "Mr. Thorne," she said, pleased that she remembered his name. "You clean up rather well." His laugh was warm and genuine. "Had to come to town for supplies anyway. Figured I might as well make myself presentable for civilized company." "And yet you still haven't spoken to my father about this supposed gold mine of yours." Magnus studied her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "Your father's made it pretty clear he's not interested in dealing with the likes of me." "Can't say I blame him. I don't exactly fit the picture of what Eastern money expects from a business partner." Victoria found herself stepping closer, drawn by something in his voice. "What if I told you that Eastern money isn't always as smart as it pretends to be? What if I told you my father's made some questionable investment decisions lately?" "I'd say that's between him and his conscience." Magnus shifted the heavy pack on his shoulders. "But I'd also say that a man who judges another by his clothes instead of his character might be missing opportunities right under his nose." "Then perhaps," Victoria heard herself saying, "you should be talking to someone with better judgment." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. Victoria Ashford didn't make impulsive decisions. She didn't talk to strange men on street corners, and she certainly didn't insert herself into business matters. But something about Magnus Thorne made her want to break all her own rules. He set down his pack and gave her his full attention. "You asking me to show you this claim, Miss Ashford?" "I'm asking you to convince me there's something worth seeing." Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I've been mining these mountains since I was 16 years old. Lost more claims than I care to count. Spent nights so cold and hungry I thought about giving up and heading back to whatever civilized place would have me. But I learned to read rock the way your father probably reads financial reports. And what I found up in Dead Man's Gulch." He paused, shaking his head slowly. "Miss Ashford, what I found up there could buy and sell this entire territory." Victoria felt her heart beating faster. "You're that certain?" "Certain enough to bet my life on it. Certain enough to work claims that most folks think are cursed. Certain enough to make promises to beautiful women who probably think I'm just another desperate prospector spinning tales." The way he said beautiful women sent heat rushing to her cheeks. No one had called her beautiful with quite that combination of reverence and challenge in their voice. "What kind of promises?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Magnus stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap mixed with mountain air and wood smoke. The kind that require considerable faith from both parties. Before Victoria could respond, her father's voice cut across the street like a whip crack. "Victoria! What are you doing?" She turned to see Harrison Ashford striding toward them, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Behind him trailed two men she didn't recognize, well-dressed gentlemen who looked distinctly out of place in Silver Creek's rough environment. "Father, you were just coming inside," Harrison said firmly, his eyes never leaving Magnus. "Mr. Pettigrew and Mr. Walsh are here to discuss the mining consortium's future, and your presence is required." Victoria caught the emphasis on required and understood. These men represented money, either investors or creditors, and Daddy needed her to play the part of the proper Eastern lady to help close whatever deal he was working on. But as she prepared to follow her father, Magnus caught her hand. "The offer stands," he said quietly, his large fingers gentle around her gloved ones. "When you're ready to see something that might change your life." Harrison Ashford's face went purple. "Sir, I'll thank you to keep your hands off my daughter. And if you think your crude advances will somehow influence our business decisions, I think," Magnus interrupted, his voice still calm but with steel underneath, "that your daughter is smart enough to make her own decisions about what she wants to see and who she wants to see it with." For a moment, Victoria thought her father might actually challenge the much larger man to a fight. Instead, Harrison grabbed her arm and steered her firmly toward the hotel. "Stay away from my family," he called back to Magnus. "We have no interest in whatever scheme you're peddling." But as they reached the hotel steps, Victoria turned back one more time. Magnus Thorne was still standing in front of Henderson's Dry Goods, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, he touched the brim of his hat in a small salute that somehow felt like a promise. That night, Victoria lay awake in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling and listening to her father's raised voice through the thin walls as he met with his mysterious visitors. She caught fragments of the conversation, words like foreclosure and final payment and 30 days, that painted a picture she'd been trying not to see. The Ashford Mining Consortium wasn't just struggling, it was dying. And if her father couldn't find a way to turn their luck around very soon, they'd lose everything. She thought about Magnus Thorne's absolute certainty when he talked about his claim. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not like she was a beautiful ornament to be admired, but like she was a woman capable of understanding important things. She thought about his promise to show her something that might change her life. Most of all, she thought about the flutter in her chest when he'd called her beautiful, and the way his rough hand had felt so gentle holding hers. By morning, Victoria Ashford had made a decision that would have shocked her Boston friends and horrified her finishing school teachers. She was going to take a very improper gamble on a very improper man. Victoria slipped out of the Grand Mountain Hotel before dawn, her practical riding skirt and boots feeling strange after years of silken stays. She'd left a note for her father, explaining that she'd gone for an early morning ride, not entirely a lie, since she'd arranged to borrow a horse from the livery stable. What she hadn't mentioned was her destination or her companion. Magnus was waiting for her at the edge of town, sitting easy in the saddle of a massive black gelding that was the only horse in Silver Creek big enough to carry him. In the pale morning light, he looked like something from a storybook, a mountain king surveying his domain. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he said as she approached on her borrowed mare. "Wasn't sure myself until about an hour ago." Victoria adjusted her grip on the reins, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "How far is this miraculous claim of yours?" 3 hours up the mountain. Rough trail, but nothing your mare can't handle if you can stay in the saddle." Victoria had been riding since childhood, but the mountain paths of Colorado were nothing like the manicured bridle trails of Boston Common. The horse picked its way carefully over loose shale and around granite outcroppings, while the world fell away on their right side in a dizzying drop to the valley floor. Magnus rode ahead of her, occasionally turning back to check her progress or point out a landmark. He moved with the natural grace of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot, and Victoria found herself studying the breadth of his shoulders and the easy way he controlled his powerful mount with just a touch of his reins. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Thorne," she called out during a brief rest beside a mountain stream. "What brought you to Colorado?" Magnus dismounted and helped her down from her horse, his hands spanning nearly her entire waist. "Same thing that brings most men west, I suppose. Looking for something I couldn't find back home." "Which was where?" "Pennsylvania. Coal mining country." He led the horses to the stream to drink. "Lost my father in a cave-in when I was 15. Mother died of the lung fever the next winter. Had a choice between following my old man into the mines or trying to make my own way." Victoria heard the pain he tried to keep out of his voice. "I'm sorry. That must have been very difficult." "Made me who I am." Magnus checked the horse's hooves while he talked. "Taught me that life doesn't owe you anything. But it'll give you everything if you're willing to work for it and smart enough to recognize opportunity when it comes." "And you think this claim is your opportunity?" Magnus looked up from the horse's hoof, his blue eyes serious. "Miss Ashford, what I'm about to show you could change both our lives. But I need you to understand something first. I'm not some desperate prospector spinning tales to impress a pretty girl. I'm offering you a partnership." "What kind of partnership?" "The kind where we pool our resources and split the profits. You bring capital and business connections. I bring the claim and the knowledge to work it." He straightened to his full height. "And maybe, if we're both very lucky, we bring each other something neither of us knew we were looking for." Victoria felt that familiar flutter in her chest. "You're assuming I have access to capital. What if my father's financial situation is worse than you think?" "Then we find another way." But Victoria, the use of her first name sent a shiver through her. "I watched you in that hotel lobby. I saw how you looked at your father when he dismissed me. You're not just another spoiled rich girl playing at adventure. You're a woman who recognizes that sometimes the biggest risks bring the biggest rewards." Before she could respond, he'd remounted and was leading them further up the mountain. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as they climbed, winding through stands of aspen and pine that filtered the morning sunlight into dancing patterns. Victoria's borrowed mare began to labor in the thin air, and she found herself grateful for Magnus's occasional stops to rest the animals. "There," he said suddenly, pointing toward a narrow canyon that cut between two massive rock faces. "Dead Man's Gulch." Victoria studied the forbidding landscape ahead. The canyon mouth was barely wide enough for two riders, and jagged rocks jutted from the walls like broken teeth. Charming name. Got it honest. 3 different mining crews tried to work claims in there over the past decade. Every one of them gave up after losing men to rock slides, cave-ins, or worse. Magnus guided his horse toward the narrow opening. "Most folks think the place is cursed. What do you think?" "I think most folks don't know how to read the signs that Mother Nature leaves when she's hiding her treasures." They rode single file through the canyon, the walls rising so high above them that the sky was reduced to a narrow ribbon of blue. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed eerily off the stone, and Victoria found herself glancing nervously at the loose rocks balanced precariously overhead. But as they rode deeper into the canyon, she began to notice details that spoke to Magnus's expertise. Wooden supports had been carefully placed to shore up unstable sections. The trail itself had been improved with strategically placed stones and packed earth. Someone had spent considerable time and effort making this passage safer. "You did all this yourself?" she asked. "Took me 2 months just to make it safe enough for regular travel," Magnus confirmed. "But it was worth every hour of work." They rounded a bend in the canyon wall, and Victoria gasped. Hidden in the heart of Dead Man's Gulch was a natural amphitheater, perhaps 100 yards across and surrounded by towering granite walls. A clear stream ran through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded from somewhere high above. The morning sun, filtering down from the narrow opening overhead, turned the mist from the falls into a shifting rainbow. But what took Victoria's breath away wasn't the natural beauty. It was the unmistakable evidence of serious mining operations. A wooden headframe rose 30 feet above a shaft entrance, with a pulley system that could lift heavy loads from deep underground. Neat piles of ore samples were arranged near a carefully constructed sluice box beside the stream. A log cabin, small but well built, sat on a level spot near the rock wall, with a stone chimney releasing a thin curl of smoke. "Magnus," Victoria whispered. "This is incredible." He dismounted and came to help her down, his hands steadying her as she stared around the hidden valley. "Wait until you see what came out of that shaft." He led her to the nearest pile of ore samples, picking up a chunk of rock about the size of her fist. In the bright mountain sunlight, veins of gold were clearly visible, threading through the quartz matrix like captured lightning. Victoria had seen enough of her father's mining reports to recognize high-grade ore when she saw it. This wasn't the fine dust that most prospectors spent backbreaking hours trying to separate from tons of worthless rock. This was the kind of rich deposit that legends were built on. "How deep does it go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've followed the vein down 40 feet so far, and it's getting richer the deeper I go." Magnus set the sample carefully back on the pile. "Based on what I'm seeing, there's enough gold in this mountain to keep us both comfortable for the rest of our lives." Victoria turned to face him fully. "Us both?" "I told you. This is a partnership offer." Magnus stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I need capital to expand operations. You need a way to save your family's fortune. But more than that." He paused, his large hands rising to frame her face with surprising gentleness. "More than that, I need someone who understands that building something worthwhile takes time and trust, and two people willing to risk everything on each other." Victoria felt the world narrow to just this moment, the sound of the waterfall, the warmth of Magnus's hands on her face, the intensity in his blue eyes that made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. "Is that a business proposal or something else?" she whispered. "Both," he said simply. "Marry me, Victoria. Be my partner in every way that matters. Help me turn this claim into an empire, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a dirty prospector." Victoria's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Magnus, we barely know each other." "I know you're brave enough to ride 3 hours up a mountain to see what a stranger wanted to show you. I know you're smart enough to recognize the value of what's in front of you. I know you're strong enough to build a life in a place like this." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her cheekbones. "And I know that when you look at me, you see something worth taking a risk on." Victoria closed her eyes, trying to think clearly. Everything about this was insane. She was a proper Boston lady. He was a mountain prospector. They'd known each other for less than a week. Marriage proposals were supposed to come after months of proper courtship, with parental approval and careful consideration of financial compatibility. But when she opened her eyes and saw Magnus looking at her with such hope and certainty, all her logical objections crumbled. "Yes," she heard herself saying. "Yes, I'll marry you." Magnus's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with the giddy relief of a gamble that might actually pay off. When he set her down, his expression grew serious again. "There's something else you need to know before we make any definite plans. I'm not the only one who knows about this claim." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "Your father's business partners, Pettigrew and Walsh, they've been asking questions around town, offering money for information about active claims, especially anything in Dead Man's Gulch." Magnus's jaw tightened. "I think someone's been feeding them information, and I think they're planning to find a way to take this away from me." "They can't just take your claim. You filed properly, didn't you?" "Filed and registered, but that doesn't mean much if someone with enough money and the right connections decides they want what you have." Magnus walked to the cabin and returned with a leather satchel. "That's why I need to move fast, and why I need a partner who understands how business really works in places like this." He opened the satchel to reveal neat stacks of official-looking documents. Victoria recognized claim certificates, assay reports, and what looked like survey maps of the entire gulch area. "You've been thorough," she admitted, impressed despite herself. "Had to be. This is my one chance to build something lasting." He closed the satchel and looked directly at her. "Our one chance, if you're really willing to take it." Victoria thought about her father's midnight meetings and the worried lines around his eyes. She thought about the words she'd overheard, foreclosure and final payment. She thought about returning to Boston as a failure. living on the charity of relatives who'd always thought Harrison Ashford had gotten too big for his britches. Then she looked around the hidden valley, with its clear stream and towering walls and the promise of gold buried in the mountain's heart. She thought about Magnus's gentle hands and his quiet confidence and the way he'd looked at her like she was capable of anything. "I'm willing," she said firmly, "but we need to be smart about this. If Pettigrew and Walsh are planning something, we need to be ready for them." Magnus nodded grimly. "Already working on that. But first, we need to make our partnership official. There's a circuit judge who comes through Silver Creek once a month. He's due back in 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Victoria's eyes widened. "Magnus, that's very fast." "Not fast enough if your father's creditors decide to make a move." He reached for her hands, engulfing them in his warm grasp. "Victoria, I know this isn't how you probably imagined getting married. No fancy church, no months of planning, no guests from Boston society. But I promise you this, if you marry me, you'll never wonder whether your husband sees you as a partner or a possession." Looking into his eyes, Victoria realized that was exactly what she wanted. Not the elaborate wedding she'd always assumed she'd have, but a real partnership with a man who valued her mind as much as her appearance. "Then let's not wait for the judge," she said impulsively. "Isn't there someone in Silver Creek who can perform a ceremony?" Magnus's eyebrows shot up. "You mean it? You want to marry me right away?" "I mean it." Victoria felt a reckless joy bubbling up inside her chest. "If we're going to be partners, let's make it official before anyone can try to stop us." Magnus whooped and swept her into his arms again, spinning her until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, his expression had turned tender. "Mrs. Victoria Thorne," he said, testing out the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Victoria admitted, surprising herself. "So do I." But as they stood there planning their impulsive wedding, neither of them noticed the glint of sunlight reflecting off something metallic high up on the canyon rim. Someone with a spyglass was watching their every move, and that someone was very interested in what Magnus Thorne was showing his fancy Eastern bride. The game for Dead Man's Gulch had just gotten considerably more complicated. Victoria and Magnus were married 3 days later in the parlor of the Grand Mountain Hotel, with only the hotel proprietor's wife as witness and a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through Silver Creek. Victoria wore her best blue silk dress, the one that matched her eyes, Magnus had said, and Magnus had somehow managed to find a proper suit that fit his imposing frame. Harrison Ashford had raged, threatened, and finally locked himself in his room when he realized his daughter was determined to go through with what he called this disastrous folly. But Victoria had made her choice, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely certain she was doing the right thing. The ceremony was brief and simple. When Magnus slipped a gold ring onto her finger, a ring he'd crafted himself from ore from his own claim, Victoria felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This wasn't a society marriage based on financial advantage or family connections. This was a true partnership between two people who'd chosen each other freely. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced. Magnus's kiss was gentle but thorough, full of promise and tenderness that made Victoria's toes curl in her silk slippers. When they finally broke apart, his blue eyes were soft with emotion. "Mrs. Thorne," he murmured against her ear. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered back, and felt him smile. But their honeymoon was cut short before it could properly begin. They'd planned to spend their wedding night at the cabin in Dead Man's Gulch, away from her father's disapproval and the curious stares of Silver Creek's residents. Victoria had packed a small bag with practical clothes suitable for mountain living, and Magnus had loaded supplies for an extended stay at the claim. They were just mounting their horses outside the hotel when a commotion erupted from the Silver Creek bank across the street. Victoria turned to see her father stumbling out the front door, his face white with shock, followed by 2 men she recognized as Pettigrew and Walsh. "Daddy?" Victoria started toward him, but Magnus caught her arm. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let's see what this is about." Harrison Ashford looked around wildly until his gaze found his daughter. "Victoria, thank God you haven't left town yet." He hurried across the street, Pettigrew and Walsh flanking him like prison guards. Up close, Victoria could see that her father's hands were shaking. "What's happened?" she asked. The bank, Harrison said hoarsely. They're calling in all our loans. Immediately. If we can't pay in full by tomorrow evening, they'll seize everything the mining consortium, our remaining assets, even my personal accounts. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face.
Tomorrow? But that's impossible. You said we had 30 days.
The terms changed, Walsh said smoothly. He was a thin man with cold eyes and perfectly waxed mustache. New information came to light regarding the consortium's true financial position. What new information? Magnus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Pettigrew stepped forward, a heavy-set man with soft hands and predatory smile. Information suggesting that Mr. Ashford has been less than forthcoming about the value of his mining claims. It seems the consortium's assets are worth considerably less than reported. Victoria saw Magnus's jaw tighten. And who provided this information? That's confidential, Walsh replied. But we're prepared to offer Mr. Ashford a way out of his difficulties. Harrison looked confused. What kind of way out? We'll assume all the consortium's debts and obligations, Pettigrew said, pulling a folded document from his vest pocket. In exchange for complete transfer of all mining claims currently held by the Ashford Mining Consortium, including any recent acquisitions or partnerships. Victoria felt Magnus go very still beside her. Recent acquisitions? It's come to our attention that certain claims in Deadman's Gulch may have become part of the consortium's holdings through marriage, Walsh said, his cold gaze flicking between Victoria and Magnus. We're prepared to be quite generous in our valuation of those properties. The hell you are, Magnus said softly. Pettigrew's smile widened. Mr. Thorne, surely you understand that your wife's debts are now your debts, and her father's obligations have become your obligations. That's how marriage works in the eyes of the law. Victoria felt sick. They'd been watching and waiting, letting her father dig himself deeper into debt, and now they were using her marriage to Magnus as leverage to steal his claim. My claim was never part of the consortium, Magnus said. I filed it independently, and it remains in my name alone. Actually, Walsh said, producing another document. According to our information, you offered Miss Ashford, now Mrs. Thorne, a partnership in that claim. A business partnership between a husband and wife creates joint ownership under territorial law, which means her father's creditors can claim it as an asset. Victoria saw the trap closing around them. These men had planned this carefully, waiting for exactly the right moment to spring it. Her marriage to Magnus, which should have been their protection, had become the weapon being used against them. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Some other arrangement we can make. Oh, there is, Pettigrew said genially. We're reasonable men. We're willing to overlook the irregularities in Mr. Thorne's claim if he's willing to work with us. What kind of work? Magnus asked. Partnership, Walsh replied. You continue operating the mine in Deadman's Gulch, but as our employee rather than the owner. We provide all capital and equipment. You provide the labor and expertise. We split the profits. Generously. 60-40 in our favor. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow evening, when your father-in-law's debts come due, we'll take the claim anyway, Pettigrew said with a shrug. Along with everything else the Ashford family owns. Victoria looked at her father, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. She looked at Magnus, whose face had gone hard as granite. She thought about the beautiful hidden valley with its promise of gold and freedom, and she felt it all slipping away. We need time to think, she said. Of course. Walsh agreed. You have until sunset tomorrow. But I should mention we've already filed preliminary paperwork with the territorial court. If you decide to, disappear into the mountains with any assets that rightfully belong to your creditors. There will be federal marshals involved. The two men tipped their hats politely and walked away, leaving Victoria and Magnus standing in the street with her devastated father. I'm sorry, Harrison whispered. Victoria, I'm so sorry, I thought. I thought I could turn things around before anyone found out how bad things really were. Magnus put his arm around Victoria's shoulders. It's not your fault, Mr. Ashford. These men were planning this before Victoria and I even met. They've been watching, waiting for the right opportunity. What are we going to do? Victoria asked. Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty she'd learned to recognize. "We're going to beat them at their own game." That night, in their small cabin in Dead Man's Gulch, Victoria learned what her new husband meant by beating them at their own game. "The key," Magnus explained as he spread his survey maps across the rough wooden table, "is that they're operating under false assumptions." Victoria bent over the maps, studying the careful notations in Magnus's neat handwriting. "What kind of false assumptions?" "They think this is the only valuable claim in the gulch." Magnus pointed to a series of marks along the canyon walls. "But while I've been working the main vein, I've been doing exploratory work too. There are at least 3 other significant gold deposits in these mountains." "Other deposits?" Magnus nodded grimly. "I've been filing claims on them quietly, one by one, under different names and through different territorial offices. If Pettigrew and Walsh manage to steal this claim, they'll get 1 mine. But I'll still own 3 others that are potentially even richer." Victoria stared at him. "Magnus, that's brilliant. But why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I wanted to be completely honest with you about what you were getting into. The partnership I offered you was real, this claim. This cabin. This life. I didn't want you to think I was holding anything back or trying to manipulate you." She reached across the table and took his hand. "And now? Now we're married. And what's mine is yours. All of it." Magnus turned his hand to grip hers firmly. "But there's more. I've been in contact with investors in Denver, real investors, not con men like Pettigrew and Walsh. They're interested in backing a large-scale mining operation if I can prove the claims are as rich as I believe they are." Victoria felt hope beginning to stir in her chest. "How much proof do they need?" "Enough to convince them to advance the capital to buy out your father's debts and fund proper mining equipment." Magnus stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. "Which is why I've been saving this." He opened the chest and lifted out a leather pouch about the size of a loaf of bread. When he poured the contents onto the table, Victoria gasped. Gold nuggets, some as large as walnuts, glittered in the lamplight. There were dozens of them, along with smaller pieces, and what looked like several pounds of gold dust in glass vials. "Magnus," Victoria breathed. "How much is this worth?" "Enough to pay off your father's debts twice over," he said simply. "I've been stockpiling it while I worked to establish the other claims. I wanted to be absolutely certain of what we had before I showed our hand." Victoria stared at the fortune spread across their table. "So we can pay off Pettigrew and Walsh?" "We could," Magnus agreed. "But that would just encourage them to try the same scheme on someone else, and it wouldn't solve the real problem." "Which is?" Magnus's expression grew hard. "These men aren't just opportunistic creditors. They're part of something bigger. I've been asking questions around town, and what I've learned isn't good. They're buying up mining claims all over the territory, using exactly these kinds of tactics. Force people into debt, then swoop in to take their properties for pennies on the dollar." Victoria sank into her chair as the full scope of what they were dealing with became clear. They're building some kind of mining empire. Exactly. And if we just pay them off and disappear, they'll keep doing it to other families. Magnus began carefully returning the gold to its pouch. "But if we expose what they're really doing, we could stop them entirely," Victoria finished. "But how?" Magnus smiled, and there was something almost predatory in his expression. "By giving them exactly what they think they want." The next morning brought unseasonable snow to the high country, turning Dead Man's Gulch into a winter wonderland of white-capped peaks and frost-covered pine trees. Victoria woke in Magnus's arms, warm beneath thick woolen blankets in their small but cozy cabin. For just a moment, she let herself pretend that they were simply newlyweds, enjoying their honeymoon, with nothing more pressing to worry about than what to have for breakfast. Then reality intruded, and she remembered that this might be their last morning as free people if Magnus's plan didn't work. "Ready for this?" Magnus asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Ready as I'll ever be," Victoria replied, though her stomach was tied in knots. Magnus's plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would appear to surrender, signing over the Dead Man's Gulch claim to Pettigrew and Walsh in exchange for assuming her father's debts. But the documents Magnus had prepared contained language that these greedy men wouldn't bother to read carefully. Language that limited their acquisition to the specific claim currently being worked, not to any future discoveries or adjacent properties. Meanwhile, Victoria would use her Eastern connections to send urgent telegrams to newspapers in Denver and San Francisco, alerting them to the story of a corrupt mining syndicate using fraudulent debt manipulation to steal legitimate claims from honest prospectors. "The timing has to be perfect," Magnus explained as they rode down from the gulch toward Silver Creek. "We sign their papers, they take possession of the claim, and then we reveal that they've been manipulating the territorial court system to defraud property owners. What if they don't care about the bad publicity?" "They'll care when their other investors start pulling out," Magnus said confidently. "Men like Pettigrew and Walsh depend on appearing respectable to attract capital. Once word gets out about their methods, they'll find it a lot harder to convince people to trust them with money." They arrived in Silver Creek to find the entire town buzzing with activity. Word had gotten out about the confrontation with Pettigrew and Walsh, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion about what the Thorns should do. "Don't let those vultures get their claws into Dead Man's Gulch," advised Old Pete from the general store.
That claim's been trouble for everyone who's tried to work it except you, Magnus. Maybe that means something.
"Take their deal," urged the hotel proprietor. "Better to walk away with something than lose everything fighting a battle you can't win." Victoria noticed that most of the people urging them to fight were folks who'd been in Silver Creek for years, who'd watched Pettigrew and Walsh circle like buzzards around struggling miners. The people advising surrender were newer arrivals, or people who seemed nervous about drawing attention to themselves. That told her something important about how widespread the corruption really was. At precisely noon, they met Pettigrew and Walsh in the Silver Creek Bank's private conference room. Harrison Ashford was there too, looking haggard but grateful that his daughter's marriage might at least save him from complete ruin. "Gentlemen," Magnus said as they all took seats around the polished table, "we've decided to accept your generous offer." Pettigrew smiled like a cat who'd cornered a particularly fat mouse. "Excellent. We have the papers all prepared." The documents were extensive and written in the kind of legal language designed to intimidate people into signing without reading carefully. But Victoria had spent enough time around her father's business dealings to understand the key points. Magnus would transfer ownership of his Dead Man's Gulch claim to the Pettigrew-Walsh mining syndicate. In exchange, the syndicate would assume all debts currently held by the Ashford Mining Consortium and provide Magnus with employment as the mine supervisor at a salary of $60 per month. It was highway robbery, dressed up in legal language. "There's just one small detail I'd like clarified," Magnus said, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom of the agreement. "This clause here about all mining claims currently held or operated by the aforementioned party, does that refer specifically to the Dead Man's Gulch property, or to any future claims I might file?" Walsh waved dismissively. "The Dead Man's Gulch claim, naturally. We're not interested in preventing you from filing new claims in the future, Mr. Thorne. We are businessmen, not tyrants." "Excellent," Magnus said, and signed his name with a flourish. Victoria watched Pettigrew and Walsh exchange satisfied glances as her husband handed over the deed to what they thought was his only valuable asset. If only they knew what was waiting for them in those mountain peaks. The signing took less than 30 minutes. When it was over, Pettigrew stood and extended his hand to Magnus. "Pleasure doing business with you, Thorne. Report to the mine tomorrow morning at 7 sharp. We'll be bringing in our own equipment and crews within the week." "Looking forward to it," Magnus replied blandly. Victoria managed to keep her expression neutral until they were back out on the street. Then she grabbed Magnus's arm. "Is it done?" she whispered. "The first part," he confirmed. "Now comes the interesting bit." They spent the rest of the afternoon sending telegrams and visiting everyone in Silver Creek who might have had dealings with the Pettigrew-Walsh syndicate. By evening, Victoria had compiled a list of 7 other mining families who'd been victimized by similar schemes over the past 2 years. "Tomorrow morning," Magnus said as they prepared for bed in their hotel room, "representatives from 3 Denver newspapers and the Territorial Attorney General's office will arrive in Silver Creek. Pettigrew and Walsh are going to have some very awkward questions to answer. And if they try to disappear before then?" Magnus smiled grimly. "I may have mentioned to a few people that they'll be visiting the Dead Man's Gulch mine bright and early tomorrow to inspect their new acquisition. The trail up there can be quite treacherous this time of year, especially if someone were to encounter unexpected delays." Victoria stared at her husband. "Magnus Thorne, you devious, brilliant man. Your devious, brilliant husband." he corrected, pulling her into his arms. And don't you forget it. The confrontation came at dawn. Victoria and Magnus were waiting at the mouth of Dead Man's Gulch when Pettigrew and Walsh arrived with a small crew of miners and a territorial marshal who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Gentlemen," Magnus called out cheerfully. "Perfect timing. I was just about to show my wife the improvements we'll be making to increase production." "Your wife doesn't need to be here," Walsh said sharply. "This is a business inspection." "Actually," said a new voice from behind them, "Mrs. Thorne is exactly who we're here to see." Everyone turned to see 3 men on horseback emerging from the trees, 2 wearing press badges and 1 with a federal marshal's star pinned to his coat. "Territorial Attorney General Morrison," the marshal announced, dismounting. "I believe we have some questions about fraudulent debt manipulation and illegal seizure of mining claims." The look on Pettigrew's face was worth everything they'd been through. What followed was 3 hours of the most satisfying interrogation Victoria had ever witnessed. Faced with documented evidence of their systematic fraud, evidence that Magnus had been quietly collecting for months, both Pettigrew and Walsh found themselves under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of territorial mining laws. The Dead Man's Gulch claim reverted to Magnus immediately, along with a formal apology from the territorial court. Harrison Ashford's debts were declared fraudulent and voided. And the Denver investors, impressed by both the quality of Magnus's gold samples and his handling of the crisis, agreed to fund a major mining operation that would make the Thorne family one of the wealthiest in the territory. But the best moment came that evening, as Victoria and Magnus sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set over the mountains that now belonged to them. "So," Victoria said, curled against her husband's side, "what exactly did you tell old Pete and the others to do if Pettigrew and Walsh tried to leave town early?" Magnus chuckled, his arm tightening around her. "Let's just say that between the accidental rock slides on the main trail and the mysterious problem with all the spare horses at the livery stable, those 2 gentlemen found themselves with very limited travel options." Magnus: "What? I never said anyone should actually prevent them from leaving. I just mentioned that it would be unfortunate if they missed their appointment with the Attorney General due to unforeseen circumstances." Victoria laughed despite herself. "You're terrible." "I'm effective," he corrected. "And I'm yours." She turned in his arms to look up at his face, still amazed that this incredible man was her husband. "So, what happens now? Do we live happily ever after?" Magnus's smile was soft and full of promise. "We work hard, we build something lasting together, and we prove that sometimes the biggest risks really do bring the biggest rewards." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of all the tomorrows stretching out ahead of them. When they finally broke apart, Victoria could see the future reflected in his blue eyes, children playing in the mountain meadows, a proper house to replace the little cabin, maybe even a small town growing up around their mining operation. "I love you, Magnus Thorne," she whispered. "And I love you, Victoria Thorne," he replied. "From the first moment you looked at me like I might be worth taking a chance on." As the stars came out over Dead Man's Gulch, Victoria reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short weeks. She'd started as a spoiled Eastern heiress trapped by her father's failing fortunes. She'd become a mountain wife with dirt under her fingernails and calluses on her palms, and a husband who saw her as his equal partner in every way that mattered. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was infinitely better than the life she'd expected. And as Magnus carried her into their cabin and closed the door against the mountain night, Victoria Thorne knew that she'd found something more precious than all the gold hidden in these hills. She'd found her home.